right.
Cloud is everywhere.
So, welcome everybody. We are going to get an update on the general plan. We had previously scheduled a different item that has now been postponed. We have a little time, so this is a good chance for us to check in and get an update. So, Pam?
Yeah, good afternoon. As you know, the Planning Department has kicked off the general plan a number of months ago, maybe over a year ago, and it's called Thrive Montgomery 2050. It looks forward 30 years to see what is the county going to plan for as it moves forward. They've reached out to lots of different communities. They spent a lot of time doing outreach, surveys, different things. They'll explain all of that. But they recently their staff went to the planning board with a draft of the issues and concerns and challenges that they see to be addressed in the next general plan update, this Thrive Montgomery 2050. So this is the committee's chance to hear what the planning staff think and the planning board's discussion on what the challenges and issues are to be addressed in this plan, and to have a conversation about your input and your questions on that. So I'll turn it over to them.
Great.
Yeah, so this is part of our commitment to you to keep you in the loop as we develop this document. The issues that you're going to see today are all, in some sense, in service of the three pillars of the plan, which are economic competitiveness, racial and social equity, and environmental sustainability. Many of them are the sorts of things that you would see in any comprehensive plan written anywhere in the country: housing, transportation, those kind of issues. But we have identified a few issues that are sometimes not included in these types of documents, including arts and culture, public health, and the need to encourage healthier lifestyles. And also the one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about recently is social capital, which is the idea of building community, not just in the sense that the built environment controls a lot of, or has a great influence on the sense of community that we have, but also attention to the idea that it is very much essential to the public interest that we think about what are the ways in which we can reinforce the sense that we have something in common, that we're all working together. And there's been a lot written about this since Robert Putnam wrote the book Bowling Alone in 2000. And I think that some of the ideas that I hope we'll see incorporated into the plan connect the work of land use, transportation, parks, and open space to the idea of community building, not just in the literal sense of building things, but in the more figurative sense. But it's, I think, at least as important.
I think Bowling Alone was written before 2000, because I remember reading about that in college, and I'm older than that.
Well, the Putnam work kind of stopped in 2000, and he continued to do research. One of the things I think that's interesting about that particular juncture is that was like the beginning of the internet. And Putnam wrote about the rise of television as one of the things that has corroded the community institutions.
95. It was an essay in the American Prospect.
My edition is 2000. Yeah, okay.
Book was 2000.
There you go.
All right. Hey,
Very good.
that's usually the way things
That's
go.
even better when we're both.
The internet.
Then we're both right.
It was effectively the basis of a program that I was in college, the 2000 books.
See, there you
Well,
go.
in 2000, Putnam wrote about the internet and the idea this might have an influence, but he wasn't writing at a time when it was really evident what the effect of, social media, Tinder, Match.com, the secondary sort of fallout from that, the decline of newspapers, all these things have an effect on community, the things that tie people together. Information communication technology is one of them, but other economic and technological forces have been, and that's what he documents in the book, is the decline of all those institutions and groupings that give us a sense of connection. And I think this is extremely important, both for what it does to the general level of cynicism and distrust that people feel about institutions generally, and specifically about what the government does. But it's also important to the equity agenda as well, because a community that it doesn't have a baseline level of trust is a community where it's going to be very difficult for all us to work together and have real respect for each other's differences. So I think this is one of the things that I'm most looking forward to in this plan, is to highlight the connection between those issues and what we do in our day-to-day work in land use transportation planning, in parks, and other things that the local government has influence over.
Cool, thank you.
That was a great introduction, and for the record, Gwen Wright, Planning Director. With me are Carrie McCarthy and Khalid Afzal, who are the co-project leads, and between the three of us, we're going to give you an update as to where we are right now on Thrive Montgomery 2050. And let's go to the first slide. So one of the things that, again, has become clear to us, not only from the outreach we've done, which started actively in June of 2019 with our Thrive Week activities, but also in just going back through old plans, going back and looking at the literature, going back and sort of understanding some of the developmental changes that have happened in the county. Is in the late 50s and early 60s, we were reflected by what you see on the far left, which was, I like to call it the STAR plan, which had been created by the Council of Governments, that talked about the District of Columbia as the hub and radiating corridors going out from the district with corridor cities along those corridors. In Montgomery County, there was literally one corridor. It was I-270. And there were corridor cities, and the rest of the county was just sort of a general blur. And we were at greenfields, and the whole focus was on trying to promote the development along one corridor, I-270. By 1993, which is the image in the middle from the goals and objectives refinement that was of the general plan that was done in 1993, we still are very much focused, as you can see, on one corridor, the I-270 corridor. The rest of the county, we do have the sort of the inner ring, which is the blue, but the rest of the county is, you know, viewed in a haze, sort of low density, very very fuzzy, and there aren't very many of the activity centers or hubs, which are the black dots that you see. It really was still very much focused on the idea of a few corridor cities. What's happened, and the map that you see on the right, is our reflection of sort of where we are today. Instead of a star-shaped plan with one big corridor coming out through Montgomery County, we've developed as sort of a fine-grained network of corridors with a variety of activity centers along those corridors. What you see on that show not only the large highways, I-270, I-495, the ICC in blue, shows the purple line, but it also shows corridors that were identified for the most part in the BRT plan, although there are a few others that we've added in that are what we see as a network or a web of corridors that is very different from where we were when we did the general plan in the 1960s, of just one corridor. We have become much more fine-grained, much more of a series of smaller activity centers. You see the blue dots in the map on the right. There are a lot more of them. We've created communities that are sort of standing on their own and maturing as their own individual community with a sense of place. Next. We also know that the county is mostly built out. You've seen this map many times with our constrained area. About 85% of the county. Now, that includes as areas that are constrained single-family neighborhoods, and we took that as a constraint. In fact, if you then look at other factors, we're calling them qualifiers, about property that is theoretically unconstrained but has multiple owners, has office buildings that may be still have a lot of useful life and aren't really ready to be redeveloped. The amount of unconstrained land, again, assuming you accept these qualifiers, becomes even less. And that really means that everything we do in this plan is going to have to focus on being fine-grained, detailed, interconnected. We just aren't going to have the big tracts of land to accomplish any of the goals of the plan. Everything is going to have to be done in a way that is, again, I think that the term we're all going to have to get really comfortable with, the terms that we're going to have to get really comfortable with are redevelopment instead of development, and revitalization in a number of our communities. Next. This also is a very interesting slide, and this is taken from the state tax assessments about how properties in the county are assessed. And you can see that single-family use is about 35% of the county. And you can see that our parks and our agricultural uses make up about another 30 or 40% of the county. Multifamily and commercial are those small boxes over on the right. They show really how little of the county is currently developed as multifamily or as commercial.
Sorry, is that based on land mass, the percentages? Land area.
Acreages.
Acreage, okay.
And what is open space recreation as opposed to parks?
Khalid Afzal for the Planning Department. That's private open space, homeowner association open space, anything that still is designated use as open space, but it's not parks property. It's
Or
not parks
agriculture.
or agriculture, or, parks includes Montgomery County parks, some state parks, some other areas like that. So this is other open space, but it's not protected parkland.
But it's not backyards, it's.
It's not backyards, it's common open
it's,
spaces. They are designated as open spaces.
Golf courses?
Golf courses or private open spaces will be golf courses.
Like a playground at an
In
HOA,
a
Yes.
homeowner
which
association,
is privately
a
run
common-
and
right.
maintained.
Yes.
That would be
On the-
included.
Exactly. They can't remove it as long as the development is
Yeah,
there
yeah.
because it's part of the approval process.
Okay.
But I think what this, again, the main thing that this really demonstrates, I think, is that, number one, we are a very green county. If you go to the top of our new building in Wheaton and look out in all four directions, what you mainly see are trees. We are, a county that is very, very green, large swaths of trees, mainly reflecting the single-family neighborhoods
You mean
that those
green
trees are located in.
in color, but that is not necessarily green in terms of environmental policy.
Well, we're pretty good, but not, we can always improve also.
Well, I'm trying to say, single-family homes, especially walking distance to Metro, is not
not a great
fundamentally not a
environmental
responsible policy
They
from a
might have a
climate.
lawn and trees, that doesn't mean
Yeah.
that they're environmentally.
Yeah,
but
I
no.
mean, we all have to acknowledge that,
Right. And the 35% of the county, again, is single-family. So when you take all of that into account, we've actually done a pretty good job based upon our original general plan of keeping development in very specific areas and keeping large portions of the county either as agriculture, as parks, as open space, and continuing to support, the historic uses of single-family zoning. In order for us to move forward and continue to thrive and grow, we're going to have to think about in 30 to 50 years, what is this same chart going to look like? What is, what
vacant-
is it going to change?
Vacant under construction is, you've got a piece of property in a residential zoned area,
It could
but
be
you're
in
not
any.
actually, you haven't built on it?
Could
In
be in
any
any
zone.
zone.
Zone that's either vacant, meaning there's no structure in the state database of real estate, or it's under construction.
Okay.
So if the building is built in a couple of years or 3 or 4 years, when they change their designation, the data would show as not vacant, not in
Okay.
this grouping anymore.
Okay, next slide. So one of the things as we've been out in the community, and we have really been out quite a lot. We have not only done the individual events that I think you all are familiar with, but we have done an online survey. We have met with a large number of stakeholder groups. We just recently had a transportation forum. We're planning some additional events through the spring. We have kept track of literally every one of the thousands of comments that we've received, and we have a database of all of those comments. As we started thinking about what we were hearing in those comments and trying to analyze what kinds of input we've gotten, one of the things that really struck us was the diversity of issues and the diversity of challenges. We certainly heard certain issues that came up again and again and again, and you're going to see how we've grouped some of those into sort of categories that will ultimately become chapters in the final general plan document. But we also were intrigued with all the different levels of diversity that we were seeing in the county. Next. We're a highly diverse county in every way, and by that, I don't think, I'm trying not to say it's only a racial equity issue. We have an amazingly diverse population in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of racial makeup, but we also have a really diverse set of living and working experiences in the county. We even have a diversity of natural resources. I know we focus a lot on protecting streams in the agricultural reserve or in the up county, but we're also seeing great movements forward to try to naturalize streams in more urban areas, in down county areas. As you know, we've been working with the Little Falls Watershed Alliance on the Willett Branch and trying to look at ways to naturalize our resources in even the most urbanized parts of the county. We have an incredible diversity of built environment, urban, suburban, and rural communities. So next. As we started thinking about our strategic framework, which we've presented to you previously, and that Casey mentioned, our outcomes that, again, if 30 to 50 years from now, if we're measuring success for this general plan, it will be to see how we stand in terms of economic health, community equity, and environmental resilience. Those are the outcomes we want to achieve. Next. But what we've tried to do with those is, really layer on and understand the diversity of issues that need to be addressed in order to achieve those three outcomes. And they are based upon the input that we've received. They are based upon this idea and this context of diversity. And we are trying to create categories of issues that we are going to explore and develop recommendations on that are not as siloed as some general plans are. Many general plans have a chapter on transportation and a chapter on housing and a chapter on land use and a chapter on environment. What we're trying to do is recognize that all of those issues are actually interconnected and that we need to view our categories of issues, our buckets, as I like to call them, as very complex, that are related to other buckets, and that need to be viewed in, in a nuanced sort of way. So based upon all of that thinking, and staff spent a lot of time looking at how we could organize these issues, because it's sort of critical. It becomes in essence, the table of contents for our final document. We came up with 8 categories of issues. I'm just going to mention them. Some of the ones that are maybe a little different: complete communities, connectedness, diverse economies, safe and efficient travel, affordability, health and sustainable environment, diverse and adaptable growth, and culture and design. And Khalid and Carrie are going to go over each of these and sort of define what they mean and some of the main issues that we heard in each of these categories. And then we're going to talk just briefly about how we're going to take this information and move to the next steps of actually developing policy recommendations and ideas for actions. So I'll turn it over to Khalid.
So the first group, complete communities, contains all the issues relating to walkability and lack of gathering places or nodes at the neighborhood level. Being primarily designed for car travel, our neighborhoods are not generally walkable, bikeable, or easy for people with disabilities. They are not diverse at the neighborhood levels in terms of the housing types and everything, and that has a lot to do with why they are not diverse, because housing types is primarily what defines one community from the other, and there's not a lot of mix of housing types that can encourage different incomes, different social groups of people living together. And that also leads to what we call our communities are not life cycle communities, meaning people, when they are ready to retire after living in a community a long time where there is their families, if they're looking for options to downsize but prefer to remain in the same community, they don't have a lot of options. And we got some feedback on that. And also I think that was part of proven by our study that we did for elderly housing a few years ago. So that lack of diversity of housing types and the way they're designed, not walkability, car-oriented and everything, is kind of what we are talking about, that our communities should be more complete in the sense that people should be able to meet their neighbors, have chance encounters, do small things within their neighborhood without having to drive everywhere, and also be complete life cycle communities.
If I could just pause you there, these are major challenges. I mean, this is like, I know we're going to scoot over to the rest of the slide, but I mean, I think you did a really good job in these 3 bullets of talking about some serious challenges that are just the way we're designed. I was dropping my kids off at school today, and I see literally like dozens of kids walking down Norwood Road to Blake High School with no sidewalk, and there's like tractor trailers zooming by them, right? We talk about Vision Zero and, what is with the lack of pedestrians and other modes of travel here.
Right.
I mean, and that's happening, and that's not unique. I mean, that's happening in a lot of places where you have that type of unsafe condition, because it was a farm, 50 years ago or less out there. So I just think the reasons we're segregated, both, socioeconomically, racial, ethnically, the type of development that's needed for people to get around safely and efficiently, and the cost. I mean, these are all, that's what we're dealing. I mean, this is a perfect slide encapsulating that, and so I'm really interested to see how this goes, of how we get there, or how your suggestions, and obviously we're going to do it together, but these are serious, serious problems about who we're going to be and how do we deal with the challenges we're currently facing. So.
A lot of these things that you'll see issues in the report come back to land use. Even if the things we're talking about, connectedness and social, it all comes down to how our communities are designed. How do we get around? How do we meet other people? Where we meet other people? I mean, until recently, until 2014, 15, when we did our subdivision code, redid that. Before that, some of you might remember there was something called re-subdivision criteria. which prohibited creating infill. If there's a property left over in a community and they came back for subdivision, it had to be the same size of lots and character as the existing. You could not change that, even if you kept the density the same. In 1969 master plan, if you look at that, there's a recommendation that density should be done on average density, not on minimum lot size. If you look at our zoning
Say
ordinance.
that again?
Can you move your mic? Can you move
Yeah.
your mic up a little
Might
bit?
be our
69
mics
master
being
plan
on.
talked about, I was looking at this one and then go back to say, what did we do in the past? 69 master plan, one recommendation is that the density should be done on average density per acre in a community, not by minimum lot size.
It was a
Which
very
was to
advanced
say,
idea.
Which was to allow,
Any
have the
size
same kind
lot,
of density, but have a diversity of sizes.
as long as you are building what was
exactly.
probably a single-family house.
Exactly.
It was
So if
not a
it's-
minimum lot size.
R200 is not all of them half-acre lots.
And was
RE1
that
is one.
recommendation adopted in the plan?
That recommendation has been used in certain zones.
Yes,
You know, we've
right.
created certain zones that allow for that kind of flexibility, but it was not adopted in the 1960s as an overall concept.
It's still, we still have R 60 or 90, well, the lot size is not 60 though, but, so,
What we call Euclidean zones mostly, which have, R60, R90, R200, RE1, they have minimum lot sizes. Some of them what's called planned community zones. That's where they were based on density, or even some of them went as far as population, but they didn't last too long. So planned community zones mostly allowed different density, different housing types within the same density calculation.
yep.
In a way, we're going back to the future. It was an idea that was really discussed in the 60s, but maybe not fully implemented, and we're sort of going back to looking at how it can be implemented.
Right. Just a quick comment to that extent. There is so much discussion out there about single-family houses and that type of zoning. I think it is worth remembering that new communities that were built in the county generally did include a wide diversity of housing types if they were larger, right? I mean, I think of them, like if you're driving in Germantown, Gaithersburg, Clarksburg, you see a lot of single-unit houses, but then you also see a lot of multifamily. It was designed into the broader plan. Whereas if you go down county into the older communities, not the same. They were built just as single-family, neighborhood, stretch after neighborhood after neighborhood. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, I think by 90s, I don't know about Clarksburg, I'm not familiar, but later on, especially that's where I'm saying planned communities, they were PD 15 or PD 24, all the planned development community zones, they were mostly, densities were referred to as same density as R60, R90, but they were allowed to have more mix of units with even, some of them even required employment, a little bit of that.
I mean, Montgomery Village is a good
Montgomery
example.
Village.
Yeah, I
Right,
think
exactly.
we've had a mixed
Mix of,
track record.
Right, yeah.
There have been, I think, places that have been successful in their time, like Montgomery Village, and we've had more recent successes like Kentlands, although that's in the city of Gaithersburg, not in the county. I think we've had mixed success in Clarksburg, although as Cabin Branch is building out, we have new multifamily buildings that are starting construction. I think we're getting some of that diversity. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times the planned development zones unfortunately ended up with perhaps too many townhouses and too few mixed single-family and multifamily. And I think as we've discussed, there are even other housing types that could be mixed in other than those three. We always focus on single-family detached, single-family attached, and multifamily. And there are other housing types that we really think can and should be explored as well.
I guess, what I'm trying to say is that sometimes it's worth, I think that we think of Montgomery County as having been zoned substantially for single-family neighborhoods, but when you look a little closer, a lot of those planned communities had a diversity of housing types within them. So it's not quite that. I think there was more foresight and concern about other policy objectives and recognition of the need for diverse housing types. But maybe to your point, at times it was built out as more towns but garden style was built, all over the place as well.
I think even then, they tried to do more of a mix of large sizes, but still single family.
Right.
That's what happens. In the early 2000s, when the Sandy Spring Master Plan was done, that's where the community said that, the wave of cookie cutter big houses is coming to Sandy Spring. We have a historic area or something. So rural neighborhood cluster zone was created at the time for Sandy Spring, and that was the first, at least I know of, what's still called Euclidean zone, that required a diversity of large sizes, but still didn't go as far as creating different housing types, like, townhouses or something. So it required that there should be, and we have for implementing that through subdivision, we had to create a table and go to the planning board and show that there's smallest size is, I think it was smallest to be 6,000 square feet or something, and the largest something, so there has to be a variety of that. But it was still single family. But that was one of the attempts to break down this, uniformity of the whole 200 acres is the same, or 200 and R1 or something like that.
Okay. All right, now there are how many of these topical categories? 12? 8? Are we going to be able to?
We can go with them quickly.
Okay.
So the second one is what Casey was talking about, connectedness, is all the issues that happen because of the land use that we talked about, land use pattern that we talked about in complete communities. I'm sorry. Social isolation, declining capital, you add to that technological dependence and unequal access to opportunities, including from job opportunities in certain low-income family areas to access to parks, activity areas that don't allow them to have a more active lifestyle. And also we are raising here at the same time the point of, if our county is going to be diverse going forward, it's supposed to be 75% people of color from 60 today. How do we plan for a more diverse county? How do we change our planning process to change with that? We can't keep doing the same kind of public hearing if we are trying to involve the number of people who are different than before. The next is
I had a great meeting with the Silver Spring team for the new master plan, and I'm repeating my offer. I would love to go door to door with the planning department in the course of that community feedback process. I think that would be really fun. I'd like to be a part of that. So,
Sign me up too.
yeah, I think we probably get a bunch of council members who'd love to do that.
Council members are pro at going door to door. We can
Hey
learn
man, that's
something
one
from
thing
you.
we know. We can give you guys some tips on that one.
For the record, Carrie McCarthy, talk about diverse economies. The economy is very important. The Fed committee spent a lot of time on those issues in the past year. We have it as one of our 3 core pillars, and then we have a chapter focus on, how can we develop an economy that works for everybody. The historical context of the plan, I think, is really important in understanding, what the issues were in the 60s, 90s, and today. And economy is key. Between 1970 and 1990, the county averaged 10,000 new jobs a year. So when they were doing those plans, there was rapid employment growth, and they were very concerned they weren't going to have enough housing to support all this employment growth. Today, the past 16 years, we've averaged about 3,700 jobs a year, and that's about what we're forecasting going forward. So we're still growing, but it's much flatter than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. So it's really a different planning context.
You said 1960 to 1990?
1970 to 1990.
1970 to 1990 was 10,000 jobs per year.
Yeah.
And then you said the past 16 years.
Yep.
So there's a little,
1990 to 2016, the data from the trends report we presented to you
that's
previously.
26 years.
26 years, excuse me.
Okay. 1990 to 2016
Yeah.
is about 3,600 jobs per year.
Yeah, 37 average.
Okay. First number was 10,000 jobs.
Where did
per
you
year.
pull that? I'd love to see that over time. Where did you get that? That's
The-
trends.
Yeah, the 26-year number was from the trends report we put out a year ago.
Okay.
I'm happy to resend you the copy. The other number was from the 1993 plan. I can kind of pull out those numbers. Because also in the 1993 plan, when they did the 1969 plan, the forecast for 1990 was 334,000 jobs. But in actual, when they got there, they had about 488,000 jobs. And these are jobs in Montgomery County. So the forecast, was a lot higher than what they expected at the time they were doing the plan.
This gets at something I wanted to mention, and we could talk about this now or if there's a better time. The STAR plan for the region that you described at the beginning, the vision of this region for the past 100 years has been a core and then radiating corridors. That is shifting beneath our feet. There is now a second star that is being created south of the core of this region in Virginia. And the amount of growth and job growth and housing growth that is being created there is having profound regional consequences. How is your plan going to talk about that and address that?
Well,
And I'm not really referring to it as on an economic competitiveness issue. This is more land use and transportation, I think.
so, we are going to look at the region. There are a lot of regional issues that need to be discussed in this plan, but we're going to also be focusing on the county because I would argue that there are hubs that have developed and exist today in Montgomery County that are places where for example, the Gaithersburg, Rockville area, including into the Great Seneca Science Corridor, where we have tremendous numbers of people who commute from Frederick to work in those locations. Those are all different patterns than existed in either the 1960s plan or the 1993 plan, and we are going to be looking
Are you looking at regional patterns? Can you look at regional patterns?
Yes, we are going to look at regional patterns as well. Although I will say the focus continues to be on what happens in Montgomery
Oh, of
County,
course.
but the region certainly
But
affects that.
we are the tail on the dog of the regional patterns. I mean, I don't know if that's the right analogy, but the point being, this whole region was mapped out according to a theory that DC was going to be the core. And I don't really
that
think it
has
is
changed.
anymore.
It
I
has
just don't think it
changed.
is anymore. And, now what are we going to, like, how much of this plan, I think, should recognize that, what the new regional pattern really is. And if it doesn't, then it's really it's not a 50-year plan.
Well, and I think from a regional perspective, you're right, but even from inside the county, that was what that first set of maps was meant to show, which is
Right.
we are a woven network within the county of centers on the east side of the county, centers on the west side of the county, centers to the north, centers to the south, and they're all connected by various corridors.
None of what I'm saying,
I think
it
it's-
detracts from the need for us to strengthen the internal organization and all of these things that we have to do. But I think we really have to be realistic and understand what the bigger context is that we're in, because it's going to have its consequences in our land use and transportation and everything.
Yep.
So
No,
we can't assume that
is important.
that the original regional plan exists anymore. There is no regional plan anymore. Virginia has completely thrown that out and is writing a new one. And it's not acknowledged at COG, I got to say. I mean, I've been saying this for years. Like, you go to these meetings and no one wants to talk about the fact that the regional plan is not the regional plan, actually. That Virginia has a different plan for everybody. And it's having effects. We're all acting like things are normal. Sure.
Well, just speaking to that, I guess the challenge that I'm having on this is supposed to be the transformational, big idea, broad-based policy that we're initiating, and I'm just wondering what that is and what's going to guide that. I mean, I understand that we're going to look at environmental, we're going to look at economic, and we're going to look at equity. And I think all those are really important frameworks for this and any discussion. The 1964 plan and then the 1969 refreshment of that, same basic plan or refinement of that same basic plan and what we've been operating under up to then was the Wedges and Quarters that came. Really, it wasn't really our idea. I mean, my understanding is it really was the National Capital Regional Planning Council's idea of DC as the center hub, and then looking at the region, creating corridors based on the major transportation routes, and then we built off of what they had created and started. At least that's my understanding of it. If I'm mistaken on that, then I'm happy to be corrected. But so that was the bone. So that conversation basically started with a regional conversation that was happening with a big idea and a big change to what the future looked like. They called it the year 2000 plan, and it became our Wedges and Quarters plan because the main focus of that year 2000 plan was the Wedges and Quarters as spokes outside of the District of Columbia as the center of gravity. What is that for this plan? I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding, because it was the Wedges and Quarters. It was that basic framework with DC being the center, as Chairman Reamer was just mentioning, that then created ultimately the 1980 decision for the Agricultural Reserve and for TDRs, and that created many of the planning decisions. Now, some of it didn't materialize, some of it we didn't follow through upon. We don't have 100,000 person population corridor cities along those corridors, but it's closer.
Yeah, pretty close, actually.
It's closer than I think most people realize that was not by chance but by choice. It probably took longer than people realize, maybe by 20 or 30 years, and hasn't happened everywhere that we had expected. But what is that?
So in answer to your question, we're trying again to take folks through this process somewhat methodically, and we're at this point trying to lay out the issues that are going to lead to the big ideas. And I would say that the best thing I can offer at this time is that our big idea is actually that first set of maps, that we are now not a series of north-south corridors. We are a web of corridors throughout the county, each of which is going to need to be developed in its own way, with its own personality, and that we believe that the wedges part of the Wedges and Quarters plan is still very important, that we should retain those great resources that we've created, but that for the remaining part of the county, we need to stop thinking of it as just a wedge of development through a sea of single-family houses or through a sea of other types of development, and we have to start thinking about it as a web. And that is the idea that, again, we're trying to move towards, but in a logical and methodical way, laying out what the issues are, what the problems are, what the goals are, and how we might solve those big problems, as was mentioned earlier.
But I think that the concept underlying the Wedges and Quarters plan in 1964 is still relevant, because what was different about that idea than like the conventional kind of bullseye of you got the city and you've got concentric circles that form this, this transect that comes out from the from the center city to the entering suburbs, the outer suburbs, the agricultural area, the ex-urban areas. It was the idea of polycentric urbanism, the idea that you do have focused growth. You don't just allow it to spread out everywhere, to sprawl, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all the most intensive growth has to happen just in the smallest concentric circle in the bullseye. It can happen out the 270 corridor. So
Absolutely.
I expect that we'll be recommending a different map than the one that's up there, which is I think what Gwen is getting at with maybe it's multiple, corridors that are a little bit more granular, as she likes to put it, fine-grained, but that it's not about just dispersing everything. It's about continuing to focus growth to get that compact form of development, which is not only more environmentally sustainable and easier and more efficient to serve with public infrastructure, but it also reinforces the benefits of urbanism economically, the agglomeration economics of getting a bunch of uses and people and activities all focused in centers of activity, complete communities, which adds to the exchange value of place. Social and economic exchange takes place when you bring diverse people, uses, activities all together in a focused way, rather than trying to spread the butter out all the way evenly across the toast. And I think that that's compatible with the idea that you just observed, that Northern Virginia is developing in a way that is not necessarily focused on D.C. Although the Amazon choice about where to put their headquarters, National Landing, in some ways is a bet on D.C. itself. It's right
True.
there.
In the urban core, in a
It's
way.
in the urban core, right?
In a way.
It's not
In-
out
in-
in Fairfax
completely.
County, out
Yeah.
on the Dulles corridor. And so, yeah, that has definitely implications for us, like through running trains to National Landing on Mark would be nice for starters, and figuring out ways to physically connect ourselves to the,
I think a few of us have been on record advocating for that.
yeah. So I thought that would probably be a winner if I brought that one up. But the idea of physically connecting by transportation infrastructure to the opportunities that are presented by Amazon presents a lot of challenges. It won't be easy or cheap to do. But I think that Amazon actually represents a bet on the future of cities and the future of urban places as being the magnet for jobs and economic dynamism. And we want to benefit from that and take advantage of that, both in creating great urban places ourselves and also connecting those to Amazon and to the opportunities in D.C. and elsewhere. And last thing I'll say, because I can't resist, D.C.'s economy is still the core. Yes, Northern Virginia is growing fast, but D.C. in terms of the region is still the epicenter of jobs and economic activity. I think by a factor of about a quarter compared to Fairfax.
Sure, but the
City
growth
in
rate is now quite different.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm just saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. To include, I think we still should view D.C. as a core to our economic future, as much as Fairfax County or what's going on.
It's core, but that's the point, is there's two cores. It's as much as.
Well, I think the other thing that I want to just add is what's hard about this plan is we are not starting with a clean slate and able to create a huge landmark kind of plan. We have a whole set of communities that exist, and our job is much more nuanced than the job was in the 1960s when they had a clean slate.
It was referred to as the American frontier. I mean, that was, I went back and read the introduction to the 1964 general plan, which gave the kind of framework for the discussion to residents, and it was referring to this kind of tabula rasa, this idea of the great American frontier, of leaving the hubbub of cities and hearing I think the sound of birds chirping was literally referenced in that introduction. So I totally agree. I think the point that is being made is the adjustment to the wedges and quarters. I do think that we ought to think through regionality as well, and not just view how easy is it to get into D.C. and how easy is it, to have proximate urbanized communities near D.C. so that people can live and work. But the region more broadly, because we are much more of a developed region certainly than we were in 1964. And so I think, the larger question, I think I agree with you. I think all evidence is that, there are more bets than ever being made on urbanized communities. That's where businesses are moving towards. That's where the significant population growth is moving towards. The idea that we're returning to the past is not just true of this particular plan. I think it's true of urban planning and land use planning everywhere in the world, that increasingly, and particularly everywhere in this country, because suburbanization was more of our idea than anywhere else's. And so, I think that makes sense. But I think the point that was being made before is that it's not just one city and we're, part of the suburban area around that city. It's a region. I agree with you that DC is still and probably will forever continue to be the center of that region, but it's a much more robust, significant area, and we need proximity to Northern Virginia as much as we need proximity to DC. And as we do land use and
That's the point.
transportation planning,
That's the point.
we need to be thinking about crossing the river as much as crossing Western and Eastern Avenue.
The other thing I want to just raise, and then we'll go back to these, the chapter descriptions, is what is going to come out of this effort. We're going to have, I think Councilmember Friedson mentioned, and it's very true, the 1960s plan did not in and of itself make huge land use changes. What it did was it laid out a work program, which the planning department then implemented over the next couple of decades. And it created the MPDU program in 1974 and the Adequate Public Facilities Program in 73. And finally, the Preservation of Agriculture and Open Space Plan in 1980. And so I've told our staff, as we are working on this plan, our goal is to lay out our work program for the next 2 decades. What should we be working on? It is not going to necessarily, with the signature on this particular general plan, change the whole county, but it is going to lay out our work program.
Yeah.
You go first.
No, I appreciate that. I think the Webs and Grains plan, not that you've called it that, but you're welcome to use it. But I do like the web. I do like that analogy. It helped me think about it more. And you're right to say, okay, work program, and then things were done. Laws were passed, decisions were made, discussions happened. I think of this as in a best context. It lays out, I think this is important, to lay out the challenges we face. Talk about how we're different. 1970, 500,000 people, now 1.1+ million, right? I think when you say it, people don't realize it's even that. I think there's people alive today that still think we're who we were then. So I think that public education process is going to be important. And then you set the context of, here are some things that we think could help get us there over the next, they're going to need to be discussions and make policy changes. And I think that's important to do as we go along this process. But I'm not looking for one, big ticket solution. I think if you can lay out, I think the better way to do it would be to lay out options and other things that you've seen in other places, have that discussion with council members and with the public. I think that it'll be received better if we do it that way. So I think the way you're approaching it is
We had a really good conversation with former county executive Ike Leggett, who has an amazing history of leadership in the county through his years on the council as well as county executive. And he came in and did a little roundtable discussion with our staff. And I was, like the David Frost interviewer. And I said at one point to him, well, what do you think should be the big idea in this plan? And he said, I don't think there should be one big idea. I think there should be multiple small but excellent and creative ideas.
Sounds like Ike.
And I thought, you know what? He's had a lot of experience in this
Yeah,
county. That
probably
was
right.
good advice.
The last thing I'll say, I'll turn it to Andrew, is the other thing is I think we need to think about, and I think you are getting into it with this page a little bit, we have to be who we are. And we are, the other places in this region don't have 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities in the country, don't have a third of their population being foreign born, all the high educational attainment, all the things we know we have. And 98% of the businesses aren't under 100 people, and 95% aren't under 50. And so there's part of this that I hope that we're doing is who are we now, and who can and should we be with the assets that we have and who we are. And so it's not always about, benchmarks are nice, other places are great, but we're unique in and of ourselves. And how do we become the best who we are? Obviously in a regional and international context, automation, everything, things are happening. But I just hope that there's some time spent on that, because I think we have unique assets and abilities and capabilities that we need to maximize, that our land use and transportation and planning and housing can support, but we have to be intentional about thinking about it.
We only have a few more of these to run through.
Last point on diverse economies is that under this umbrella, we are working on the study that Councilmember Reamer requested, looking at how universities have catalyzed economic growth in other places, and we'll have more on that soon.
Thank you.
Under safe and efficient travel, this is essentially, transportation, but a key change is the name, safe and efficient travel. And so under this category, we're looking at all the Vision Zero priorities, those issues we're working on. We're looking at, as we've talked about already, the transportation challenges resulting from the fact that the county is really polycentric, and we're part of a polycentric region. And so the transportation network has really been designed with more of a monocentric theme, and how to think about that going forward. Or emerging technologies, we don't know what's going to happen with self-driving cars, but building that as part of the conversation and thinking about how to be flexible going forward. And lastly, corridors are a key theme of this plan. Sometimes I call this plan reinventing corridors. And corridors are important connectors for getting from point A to point B, but they're also really significant barriers cutting through neighborhoods, and the lack of a comprehensive grid system. So those are issues we're working on.
And to that end, I just want to put in a plug. Next Tuesday, February 11th, we're having the second in our winter speakers series called Big Ideas. And the one on February 11th is about big ideas in transportation. It's going to touch on many of these issues. We have Gabe Klein, who was previously the director of transportation in the district. We have a speaker who was the deputy transportation director in the city of Pittsburgh. And we have a third speaker who I can't think of at the moment. But it's going to be a great session. Please come, and we encourage you to spread the word.
Under affordability, we're looking at both housing affordability and commercial affordability. You're familiar with all of the housing affordability issues. You spent a lot of time on it. We're sort of covering all of those issues. Going forward, how do we have enough of the different types of housing we need? Ties into the complete communities theme Khalid talked about earlier. We're doing a housing needs assessment that's required by the state of Maryland. That's going to sort of look at what we think is going to happen going forward, what we think we're going to need. It's going to be a little more granular than the work we did in the trends report, looking at some sub areas of the county. It'll still be pretty high level overall, but it'll give us a refine a few of the forecasts going forward. And then commercial affordability is, important issue as well, both so that businesses who are successful aren't being priced out, and how to have real estate that allows entrepreneurs to take risks, because it's not so expensive. So real estate and other investments in the county that the barrier's too high to get started.
So next on healthy and sustainable environments, both talks about two sections, both human health and environmental health. On human health, it brings up a lot of issues of inequality based on income and land use, about how certain communities don't have access to all the facilities, and the trends toward more car-oriented and everything keeps even some seniors from having to access these facilities, including the trend, both commercial and on the public side, is consolidation and creating bigger facilities for savings of the bigger in scale, but it loses that small scale access from the communities, and that means you have to rely more on car or Uber or something to access these facilities. On the environmental side, Montgomery County has been in the leadership, very aggressive in terms of all of its environmental preservation and everything, but there are still challenges on that, which will be further exacerbated by climate change. It's a whole new threat that's going to change everything, almost impact every aspect of our life. And the last thing, we're also looking at that in terms of water and sewer capacity, especially water with the climate change and how that will be planned. And we are working with WSSC on that and working with them about how they are planning on that. The next is the diverse and adaptable growth. These are typically the issues that you will see under land use section of a typical master plan, but in this case we are expanding it to talk about the idea that, again, in the future we have to be more adaptable. Our land use has to be more adaptable. We are changing at a much faster pace today than we were in the past, including autonomous vehicles and other technologies and everything that are creating different challenges. In this case, we are talking about corridors, again, as part of our growth scenario, in addition to making them more livable places, not just traffic arteries, but also as we're going forward, how do we create this diversity of housing? If we keep going the way we are, yes, we have zoning capacity, everything to accommodate 200,000 more people that are projected in the next 30 years, but we are reinforcing the same, the few housing types and everything. The corridors where we have the new BRT and housing, and the transit, that can help us create more opportunities for missing middle and diversity of housing types. And we have agricultural reserve. It's a great resource, great asset, but again, everything is changing around it. Agricultural industry is changing, how we market that is changing. So we have to find a new viability and justification about what's the best use for agricultural reserve going forward.
And we've just completed an agritourism plan in conjunction with our agritourism advisory committee, and we'll be sharing that with the council. I think it offers some good ways forward.
And lastly, growth management. We are looking at subdivision staging policy, but we are also looking at a little broader picture, longer view that do we keep, especially with different kind of growth, instead of greenfields or infill and redevelopment, do we still, or these tools that we have in the past from transportation and housing and all the other about how infrastructure keeps pace with that, are they still appropriate for different kind of growth that we'll be doing in the future?
I want to just raise one thing, and you don't have to answer it if you haven't thought about it, but like climate refugees, I read an interesting article the other day about, particularly people from the coasts, and South. As that happens, which could happen in the life of this plan in the next 20 years, people move because of unstable climate, whether it be the West Coast or in the South, the flooding and other things. Our area could potentially be the landing spot or beneficiary from some of these folks because we have a more relatively stable climate and still economic diversity and racial and ethnic diversity. So I just point that out to just something, and if I can find the article, I'll send it to you, but it's just something to think about. It made me think about our growth projections long term, about maybe there's something to that, and it would probably be on the margins, but just something to think about.
No, absolutely. I mean,
Maybe we could move the capital back to Brookville.
Right.
Yeah. We don't have any, coastal area, but sea level rise will exactly create those kind of impacts that people will have to move in.
Right.
More inland, meaning we are inland, so, that's where they will go.
No, that's what I mean, yeah.
Exactly.
Not our climate, people coming to us.
To
So,
us,
I mean,
exactly.
that might be an opportunity for additional, that's what I meant, yeah, thank you.
The last one is culture and design. Again, we are coming back to the idea of diversity, county becoming more diverse, and the county has been great at supporting culture and nonprofits, but we need to do it differently and respond to the changing demographics. And also on the design side, we are again going from greenfields to infill and redevelopment will require different kind of design focus. Not only but just buildings and open spaces, but design of our communities, infrastructure, responding to climate change and everything. And with that, we are up to next steps.
Yeah, so again, our goal today was to give you an update, to let you know where we stand, to give you a sense of the direction that things are heading. I've been making notes of some of your comments. I think you've given us some great input about focusing on the regionalism aspects of things. We are going to be presenting the issues report to the planning board on February 27th. And at that point, we're going to launch directly into developing our goals, policies, and actions. I think what everyone's interested in are the actions. You know, they would love, but we're still a few months away from that. For each of these categories, we're going to be laying out what we think are the public policies that should be directed towards addressing the issues that have been mentioned, and we'll be suggesting some specific actions. Again, not actions that would be memorialized as part of this actual plan adoption, but that would be our work program of actions we should take up to implement the policies. As we begin putting those together, we're going to be continuing. Maybe you could do the next slide. This gives you an overall timeline of the project. We're going to be continuing to get feedback on those goals and policies really through June. And we're going to be hopefully developing a working draft of the document to be presented to the planning board in September. At which point there will be public hearings and work sessions, and again, we're viewing that deadline that we were given by you all of getting the document from the planning board to you all by March or so of 2021. That's still our timeline, that's our goal. We will continue to come back to you periodically, just like this, and brief you on what's happening, because again, our greatest hope is to not end up before you in April of 2021 and have you all look at this plan and say, you know, what were you thinking? This is crazy, you know, start over. We want for this to be a process where we are in close communication throughout the process. So that's what we had to present today, and if you have additional comments, we would love to hear them.
Thank you. Is this the same timeline that it has been for the past year or so? Okay. This is the expedited version. All right. One thing I wanted to ask about, I would really appreciate seeing a history chapter that looks at the history of land use and housing and especially the dimension of race. I think it's just such a significant thread in our story, and I think it belongs in a history or in a vision document about land use, because it has been a driving motivator of land use for, you know, since the beginning of time. And I think it would be really useful to help contextualize, you know, what we see around us today and what we're talking about in this plan, according to a cogent exposition of that issue. You know, it could be 4 or 5 pages. I don't know how long exactly. I don't know how long the whole plan is.
Our equity working group has been working on exactly what you've just described. We're hoping this plan is not a, you know, thick tome, but rather, you know, that we can keep it to 70 or 80 pages. It may end up having appendices and other kinds of attachments, but we absolutely agree with the recommendation of looking at the history, and we have a group of staff working on that.
I want Andrew Friedson's grandson to be able to, you know, figure out what we thought, what we were, you know, whether there was, when he reads the chapters, he's sitting here at this dais. You know, it's an important reflection of the moment that we're in, and I think it's going to play out a lot in terms of the policy decisions that we make.
I couldn't agree more with that. I think the history would be extremely helpful. And I think as an appendix, I mean, I think that makes it as a standalone document, but also an accessory document to this, because I think there are broader uses than just for the general plan, that, you know, having it as almost, you know, as a standalone but connected document could be helpful as a reference point for moving forward. I think for a lot of the decisions that we make and a lot of the context that we need to make those decisions. I'd also add, and I don't know how often this is done or if it's been done, but I'd be interested to see successes and failures of what we wanted and what we predicted from the 1964-69 master plan and what we've achieved. You know, what actual land use turned out to be. I mean, my sense is we've followed the plan to some extent, and we haven't followed other parts of the vision in others based on practical and political realities of decisions that are made right here at this dais. And, you know, I think it'd be helpful for us to use this opportunity to look back and say, here's what we set out to do, here's what we wanted to do and did, which actually didn't turn out as well as you know, or exactly as they had anticipated when they had put forward this plan. Here are the things that we said we were going to do and didn't and fell short, and here are the things that we set out to do that we did. And you know, I think that retrospective would be really helpful. Again, it doesn't have to be part of the core plan. It could be a addendum to the plan, but I think it's hard to set out on this, particularly because we're not throwing it out. I mean, it sounds to me, I mean, you mentioned reinventing corridors. I wrote down modern wedges and more corridors. You know, that's what this plan sounds like to me. And I'm not opposed to that. I actually think you know, I agree that there are a lot of benefits to that. And I think in many ways, the 1964 plan was way ahead of its time. And perhaps at some points we fell short because we weren't ready for some of the decisions that needed to be made at the time when the decision point came forward. So I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I do think, you know, when we talked about the big idea and the question, you know, I'm not necessarily disagreeing or agreeing. I was just raising the question. There was a big idea, and it seemed to me that that wasn't organic in the process, that the plan started with that idea as part of a regional conversation. I'm not married to the idea that there has to be one idea, or, you know, Ike Leggett's usually right when we disagree. So, you know, his idea of having smaller ideas, you know, I don't have an outcome that I'm, you know, specifically focused on here. But I think to the point made earlier, the regional context that this was part of, I think, is critical. And I think, if anything, we're a far more regional place than we were in 1964. We were a more DC-centric place in 1964, and so that part of the regionality was critical. But we are more regional, and I think the region is broader than it used to be, with Frederick and Howard, Prince George's, and, you know, obviously Prince George's was part of the original conversation. Fairland even was in the original plan, but you know, I think that ought to be part of it. The other thing that I just wanted to raise, and I don't necessarily have a huge problem with it, but I think that Gwen, you mentioned earlier about you know, saying to your team you want this to dictate the work plan for the next 20 years, which I think makes sense. But I don't think that we should set the work plans for the next 20 years and then backtrack into the plan. I think we should come up with a plan, and then that should then dictate the work program. Yeah. I thought you meant that. I just wanted to clarify, because you know, the whole purpose of this exercise is to take, you know, if a master plan is a 1,000 foot perspective and a site plan is a 1 foot perspective, you know, this should be a 10,000, 30,000, 50,000, 100,000 foot perspective. And so we got to start from the sky and then move down from there. So I just wanted to raise that. I was certain you meant that, but I just wanted to clarify. So thanks.
Thank you. I'm glad Councilman Friedson brought that up. I think I just want to say webs and grains, okay? Just but the travel patterns. So it was mentioned, you know, we need to be looking in the regional context, which I 100% agree. But as we're doing the historical look back, I remember one of your great staff, it might be Lisa, has repeatedly said to me in a different context that Montgomery County travel patterns tend to be more insular, and as far as work, you know, people going to work and where they go. And so I think if that, I'd be curious to know, to the extent that we can, how long has that been the case? And, where are people going? I just think as we're thinking of particularly the travel, transportation side of this plan, that's something we need to make those decisions in the context of who we are. Again, back to who we are. Not that we have to be or should be what we have been. We should be more than that, and we can be. But I think we need to be clear-eyed and going in and knowing what we're currently doing and where are our people going. Just by facts of what we've developed so far as we do that historical look back. And then the other thing on the history, the equity committee, I'd love to at some point maybe even we don't have to do it. I don't know how we do it, but a more in-depth talk about what they're looking at and how far back they're going. I often think, it's one of the things that always has bugged me in the curriculum. We start Black history at the Civil Rights Movement, and obviously, the Montgomery bus boycott, which it's obviously was not where things started. And so, all of us who have had the benefit of this racial equity training, I think the broader community would benefit from a deeper and longer look back of how we got where we are and who was given land and all that.
Actually, I'm participating with a number of other executive branch department heads in a GARE, Government Accountability for Racial Equity, training that's being done through COG. It's a year-long, it's like a Leadership Montgomery where you go once a month for a full day. And one of our very first assignments was to create a racial equity timeline for our jurisdiction.
That's great.
And so we did, everyone else on the committee turned and looked at me and said, you can help with that, right, Quinn? And so, of course, I said, my staff can. And we created that, and I'll send it around just as an FYI.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Well, generally I want to just convey that I hope this plan has a lot of very substantive recommendations that, are meaningful. And my feeling about it is this is only worth doing if we take on controversial, difficult issues and get them down on paper. This will have been a symbolic exercise that doesn't change anything, if we don't put everything in there. So, please don't be shy in, how you're thinking about this. And I know you're not, but I want certainly to convey my hope here is that this is a place where really ambitious, different ideas will get an airing and will ultimately be in there. And it's just not, we're spending a lot of time on this. This is taking up the planning resources of this department, and it needs to be more than, a pretty set of pictures and some nice prose. This has got to be real. And so you got to take on, whatever it is. I don't even know what it is.
Have I ever delivered a milquetoast plan that
That's not that. You don't have that word. It doesn't even. It's not in your DNA.
Too many happy people. Is that your? Complaint?
You did mention spreading the butter, and I'm just wondering what type of toast butter is being spread across.
That was a pleasing image in my mind as you said it. So please don't be shy and make it worthwhile. Let's do this. Let's go big or go home. Thank you for the update. Really appreciate it. And thank you. Good use of our time. And we'll see you soon. All right.